My parents announced they're only keeping the child who contributes most financially by age 25, and the others will be cut off completely. My father stood at the head of the dining table with a spreadsheet projected on the wall behind him, showing 3 columns labeled with our names and a 4th column titled Lifetime Financial Contribution Target, $50,000. My mother sat to his right with her laptop open, taking notes the way she did during her corporate board meetings, and I felt my stomach drop before Dad even started speaking. This was a family dinner on my 21st birthday, and instead of cake and presents, I was staring at what looked like a business proposal for disposing of 2 of your 3 children. Dad clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline running from today until each of our 25th birthdays, and explained in his calm executive voice that he and Mom had been discussing their estate planning and retirement strategy. They'd realized they'd been approaching parenthood inefficiently by spreading resources across 3 children when they could maximize impact by investing everything in one. The child who contributed the most money to the household by age 25 would become the sole heir to their estate, would maintain family relationships, and would receive their full support going forward. The other 2 would be financially cut off, removed from the will, and expected to cease contact with the family permanently. My younger sister May was 19 and sitting across from me with her mouth literally hanging open in shock. My older brother Lucas was 23 and had gone completely still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth like he'd been frozen mid-motion. I could see him processing the timeline, calculating that he had less than 2 years to somehow contribute $50,000 or be disowned. Dad continued his presentation like he was pitching investors, rather than telling his children they were entering a competition for their own family membership. He explained that we'd each be given a tracking account where we could deposit our financial contributions, that the money could come from anywhere as long as it was legally earned, that the deadline was firm with no extensions, and that the child with the highest total on their 25th birthday would win. Mom added that this wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about teaching us the value of financial responsibility and hard work. She said they'd thought carefully about this decision and believed it would ultimately benefit everyone by forcing us to develop real-world skills and independence. The children who didn't win would actually be better off in the long run because they'd learn to survive without family wealth as a safety net. I'd been living a normal middle-class life for 21 years, thinking I came from a supportive family that valued education and personal fulfillment over money. My parents had always emphasized following your passions and doing meaningful work, had told us repeatedly that they'd support our choices regardless of career path. I was finishing my senior year at State University studying elementary education, planning to become a teacher because I loved working with kids and wanted to make a difference. The starting salary for teachers in our area was $32,000 a year, which would barely cover my rent and student loans, let alone allow me to contribute $50,000 to some family fund. Lucas was 2 years into a PhD program in environmental science, living on a graduate stipend of $24,000 annually, and drowning in research that would never make him wealthy. May was a sophomore studying art history and dreaming of working in museums, another field notorious for poverty-level wages. None of us had chosen our paths expecting to get rich, because our parents had always said money wasn't what mattered most. Now, suddenly, money was the only thing that mattered, the only metric by which our worth as children would be measured. Dad clicked to another slide showing the calculation method. Every dollar we contributed would be tracked, and there would be monthly statements showing our running totals and comparative rankings. He'd created a formula that accounted for our different timelines, giving Lucas less time but also higher expectations since he was older, while giving May more time but proportionally higher targets. The system was designed to be fair, according to Dad's corporate logic, but it was actually insane. I raised my hand like I was in class, realized how absurd that was, and just started talking. I asked how we were supposed to contribute $50,000 while working entry-level jobs and paying for basic living expenses. Dad said that was exactly the point of the exercise, learning to prioritize and make tough financial decisions. If we couldn't figure out how to generate that much money, we probably weren't the kind of strategic thinkers who deserved the family inheritance anyway. The inheritance he was referring to was substantial, probably close to $3 million based on what I knew about their investments and property values. But they were willing to cut 2 children out of that entirely, leave them with nothing, just to teach some twisted lesson about capitalism and worth. The rest of the birthday dinner was surreal. Mom brought out a cake she'd made, sang happy birthday in her cheerful voice like she hadn't just announced a gladiatorial competition between her children, and served slices while discussing the logistics of the tracking accounts. She'd already set them up with a bank her company used, had printed out welcome packets with account numbers and deposit instructions, handed them to us like party favors. Lucas excused himself and left without touching his cake. May started crying silently, tears running down her face while Mom pretended not to notice and Dad checked his phone. I sat there trying to process the complete disconnect between the parents I thought I knew and these people treating their children like investment portfolios that needed to be optimized. When I asked if this was some kind of elaborate joke, Dad looked genuinely confused by the question. He said he'd spent weeks developing the tracking system and the comparative formulas. Did I think he'd waste that much time on a prank? The spreadsheet behind him showed projected contribution trajectories for each of us based on average salaries in our chosen fields, and all 3 lines ended well below the $50,000 target. We were all predicted to fail. That's when I realized the competition might not be about finding a winner at all, but about justifying cutting all three of us off while claiming they'd given us a fair chance. The next morning, I called Lucas and May for an emergency sibling meeting at a coffee shop near campus. We sat in a corner booth and tried to make sense of what had happened. Lucas was furious, kept saying he'd dedicated the last 5 years of his life to environmental research that mattered, that he was on track to publish important papers about climate change, and now our parents were telling him none of that counted because it didn't generate enough money. May was still in shock, kept asking if maybe they'd change their minds once they saw how crazy this was. I tried to be the rational one, suggested we could all just refuse to participate and maintain our relationships with each other regardless of what our parents did. But Lucas pointed out that refusing to participate was the same as losing, that the tracking accounts existed whether we used them or not, and if we didn't make deposits while the others did, we'd end up at zero by default. We were trapped in a system we hadn't asked for and couldn't escape without accepting automatic disownment. The conversation kept circling back to the same impossible math. Even if I got a teaching job immediately after graduation and lived on absolute poverty wages, I'd be lucky to save $5,000 by age 25, let alone $50,000. Lucas had 2 years to find that money while finishing a PhD that required 60-hour weeks in a lab. May had the most time but was studying a field with negative job prospects. I started researching that week, trying to understand if what our parents were doing was actually legal. Turned out conditional inheritances were completely normal, that parents could structure their wills however they wanted as long as the conditions weren't illegal or unconscionable. Making inheritance contingent on financial contribution probably fell into a legal gray area, manipulative and psychologically abusive but not technically criminal. I found forums full of people whose parents had done similar things, created competitions or conditions or tests that siblings had to pass to earn family membership. The comments were full of horror stories about destroyed relationships and permanent psychological damage, but also full of people saying the kids should just work harder, that family money should go to whoever earned it. I spent hours reading through these threads, seeing my future written out in other people's tragedies. The common pattern was that one sibling would sacrifice everything to win, would destroy their health and relationships and integrity chasing the money, while the other siblings either gave up entirely or fell into depression and resentment. No matter who won, the family ended up fractured beyond repair. Nobody looked back on these competitions as valuable learning experiences. They looked back on them as the thing that taught them their parents' love was conditional and transactional. My own financial situation was grim when I actually calculated it. I was graduating in May with $42,000 in student loans at 6.8% interest, which meant I'd be paying around $350 per month just to cover the minimum payments. Starting teacher salary in my district was $32,000, which after taxes came out to about $2,400 monthly. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment near the school district where I'd applied was $950. Car payment was $280. Car insurance was $140. Health insurance through the school district would be $160. Phone bill was $70. That left me with roughly $500 per month for food, gas, utilities, and every other expense of existing. Saving $50,000 in 4 years would require setting aside over $1,000 monthly, which was literally impossible given my budget. I made a spreadsheet showing my parents exactly why their target was unrealistic, emailed it to them with a detailed explanation of the economics of entry-level teaching positions. Dad replied that if I found teaching insufficient to meet my financial goals, I should consider a more lucrative career path. That's when I understood this wasn't about teaching us financial responsibility. It was about forcing us to abandon our chosen careers and values in pursuit of money, or punishing us for refusing to do so. Lucas started exhibiting stress symptoms within the first month of the competition. He called me at midnight one night hyperventilating, said he'd calculated that even if he dropped out of his PhD program and got a full-time job immediately, he probably couldn't save $50,000 by age 25. He'd lose years of research, would never finish his degree, would abandon work he believed was critical to understanding environmental systems, and he still might not contribute enough money fast enough to win. But if he stayed in the PhD program doing work that mattered to him, he was essentially accepting disownment. The choice was between betraying his values or being cut off from family. I tried to talk him through breathing exercises and reminded him that our parents were the ones creating this impossible situation, that their demands didn't reflect his worth or the value of his work. But my reassurances felt hollow because the financial reality was still there. The tracking account existed. The deadline was real, and Lucas was running out of time to decide between his career and his family. He'd started developing insomnia, was losing weight, was having panic attacks during lab work. His advisor had noticed the change in his performance and pulled him aside to ask if something was wrong at home. Lucas had explained the situation, and his advisor had been horrified, said it was the most unethical parental behavior he'd encountered in 30 years of academia. May's response to the competition was different. She dropped out of college 3 weeks after our parents' announcement, said she couldn't afford to waste time studying art history when she needed to be earning money. She'd moved back home and gotten a job as a bank teller making $31,000 annually, started depositing chunks of her paychecks into the tracking account and living on almost nothing. When I visited her at our parents' house, she looked hollow, like something essential had been carved out of her. She was 19 years old and had abandoned her education and her dreams to chase a monetary target that might not even make a difference in the end. I asked her why she was doing this, why she wasn't just continuing school and seeing what happened. She said someone had to try to win, someone had to take this seriously, and since Lucas and I weren't willing to sacrifice our careers, she'd have to be the one. The martyrdom in her voice scared me. She'd transformed from a creative, passionate kid who lit up talking about Renaissance painting into an exhausted teenager working 50-hour weeks at a bank she hated, living at home with parents who treated her as an investment vehicle. I tried to convince her to go back to school, but she said she'd already withdrawn officially and gotten a refund on her spring tuition. That money, about $8,000, was sitting in her tracking account earning interest. 4 months into the competition, I graduated college and started my teaching job at Riverside Elementary. The work was exactly as fulfilling and financially devastating as I'd expected. I loved my students, believed in what I was doing, and earned so little money that I qualified for food stamps. My checking account balance at the end of each month hovered around $200 after all my bills were paid, and the tracking account our parents had set up sat completely empty. I hadn't made a single deposit, couldn't afford to make a deposit, and was increasingly feeling like my refusal to participate was just passive acceptance of losing. My parents called monthly to ask about my contribution status, spoke to me in disappointed tones when I reported 0 deposits. Mom suggested I could tutor on weekends or pick up a second job waitressing if I was serious about staying in the family. Dad sent me links to higher-paying careers, sales positions, and corporate training programs that had nothing to do with education, but would definitely boost my earning potential. Every conversation reinforced that my chosen career was worthless to them, that the work I found meaningful was actually proof of my failure. They were systematically devaluing everything I cared about and measuring my worth exclusively in dollars. The turning point came 6 months into the competition when Lucas called me at 2 a.m. from the hospital. He'd collapsed in his lab from what the doctors thought was stress-induced cardiac arrhythmia, heart palpitations severe enough that his colleagues had called an ambulance. I drove 3 hours to get to him and found him in the ER looking gray and exhausted, hooked up to monitors tracking his heart rhythm. The attending physician, Dr. Amelia Shu, asked to speak with me privately and explained that Lucas's physical symptoms were being caused by severe anxiety and chronic stress. His heart was structurally fine, but the psychological pressure he was under was manifesting as dangerous physical responses. She asked what could be causing this level of stress in a 23-year-old graduate student, and I found myself explaining the whole situation. Our parents' competition, the impossible financial targets, the looming disownment. Dr. Shu's expression shifted from professional concern to something harder. She said she'd been practicing emergency medicine for 18 years and had seen plenty of cases where family dynamics caused serious health problems, but this was one of the most calculatedly cruel situations she'd encountered. She offered to document Lucas's condition and write a letter to our parents explaining the medical harm their competition was causing. Maybe that would snap them out of it. I took Dr. Shu's letter, a 2-page medical document explaining that the stressors Lucas was experiencing had caused acute cardiac symptoms and posed ongoing health risks, and I forwarded it to my parents along with a message saying the competition needed to end immediately. My father's response came 3 hours later via email. He said Lucas's health episode was unfortunate, but it suggested he wasn't handling pressure well, which was actually valuable information about whether he was suited to be the family heir. A successful person needed to manage stress effectively, and if Lucas couldn't do that, he was proving he wasn't the right choice. The response was so cold, so completely devoid of parental concern, that I read it 5 times trying to find some hint of humanity buried in the corporate language. There was none. My mother added a follow-up email saying they hoped Lucas recovered quickly and would be back to making contributions soon. Not, we're worried about you. Not, your health matters more than money. Just concern about the impact on his tracking account. That's when I started documenting everything. Every email they sent, every phone call where they discussed the competition, every monthly statement showing our comparative financial contributions. I created a folder on my computer called Evidence and began building a record of exactly what our parents were doing to us. Lucas dropped out of his PhD program in September, 8 months into the competition. He sent an email to his department explaining that family circumstances required him to leave academia, thanked his advisor for the mentorship, and started applying for corporate environmental consulting jobs that would pay $65,000 to $75,000 annually, instead of the $24,000 stipend he'd been living on. His advisor wrote him a recommendation letter while also sending me a message saying it was criminal for someone with Lucas's research potential to be forced out of science for financial reasons, that Lucas had been on track to do genuinely important work on wetland ecosystem restoration. But Lucas needed money more than he needed to save wetlands, because our parents had structured reality, so that was the only rational choice. He got hired at an environmental consulting firm in October, making $72,000 a year, and immediately started depositing $3,000 monthly into his tracking account. Finally putting up real numbers, finally competing seriously. When I talked to him about the career change, he sounded defeated even while describing his success. He said the work was fine, it was related to his field, but it wasn't what he'd spent 6 years training for. He was doing environmental impact reports for corporate developments instead of researching conservation strategies, making money instead of making progress. May's tracking account balance hit $22,000 in November, 11 months into the competition. She'd been depositing essentially her entire salary minus minimal living expenses, was surviving on our parents' food and housing while saving everything else. She'd also started doing freelance bookkeeping on the side, adding another $500 to $1,000 monthly. Her running total was higher than Lucas's, even though she'd been earning less, because she'd been depositing aggressively from day one, while Lucas had initially refused to participate. The monthly family statements our parents sent showed the standings: May at $22,000, Lucas at $9,000, me at $0. The rankings were accompanied by Dad's analysis of our respective strategies and predicted outcomes. He praised May's commitment and financial discipline, noted Lucas's late start but strong current contribution rate, and described my zero balance as indicating a fundamental lack of seriousness about family relationships. Reading those statements felt like being graded on my worth as a human being and receiving a failing mark every single month. The psychological weight of seeing your name at the bottom of a family ranking, of having your parent explicitly state you're losing the competition for their love, that damage was cumulative and crushing. I started seeing a therapist in December, a woman named Dr. Regina Okafor, who specialized in family trauma and toxic relationship patterns. I spent the first session crying while trying to explain the tracking accounts and the $50,000 targets and my siblings' total transformations. Dr. Okafor listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and then said something that shifted my entire perspective. She said what my parents were doing had a name in psychology literature: financial coercion and conditional affection, a form of emotional abuse where love and family membership are made explicitly transactional. She said it was particularly insidious because it used the appearance of fairness and meritocracy to disguise the manipulation, made it seem like we had choices and agency when actually the whole system was designed to damage us regardless of who won. Even the child who contributed the most money and won would be psychologically harmed by learning that family love was something you purchased rather than something you received inherently. Dr. Okafor asked if I'd consent to her writing a professional assessment of the family dynamic, something I could potentially use if legal intervention became necessary. I agreed, desperate for any kind of external validation that this wasn't normal, that my reaction wasn't oversensitive. The first-year anniversary of the competition arrived in late January, and my parents hosted a formal dinner to review our progress and discuss strategy for year 2. May's balance was $26,000. Lucas's was $15,000. Mine was still $0. The dinner felt like a corporate performance review, with Dad presenting graphs showing our contribution trajectories and Mom offering feedback on our financial decision-making. May was praised extensively for her discipline and sacrifice, held up as the model we should all follow. Lucas was acknowledged for his improvement but criticized for his slow start. I was told directly that my continued zero balance was disrespectful and suggested I didn't value family relationships enough to put in effort. When I tried to explain that I literally didn't have money to contribute after covering basic living expenses on a teacher's salary, Dad said that was a choice I'd made by pursuing a low-value career. If I'd chosen a more lucrative field, I'd have money to contribute. The fact that I'd chosen teaching proved I prioritized personal satisfaction over family commitment. The argument that followed was brutal, with me trying to defend the value of education and service work, while my parents essentially said those things only mattered if you could afford them, and I clearly couldn't. The realization that changed everything came 3 weeks after that anniversary dinner when I was having coffee with an old family friend, Rita Alvarez, who'd known my parents for 20 years through their social circle. I mentioned casually that I was stressed about family stuff, and Rita asked if everything was okay between me and my parents. Something about her genuine concern made me tell her the whole story: the competition, the tracking accounts, the $50,000 targets, Lucas's health crisis, May dropping out of school. Rita listened with increasing horror, and when I finished, she said something that made my hands go cold. She said my parents weren't struggling financially, weren't in any position where they needed to consolidate resources or cut expenses. They'd just gotten back from a 3-week vacation in Italy that cost at least $20,000, had bought a vacation property in Colorado last year for $400,000 in cash, and were planning a home renovation that was budgeted at $180,000. They were spending money lavishly on themselves while telling their children to compete for $50,000 like it was life-changing money for the family. The competition wasn't about financial necessity. It was about control and cruelty, and teaching us that our worth was measured in dollars. I went home and started investigating my parents' finances using the access I still had to some old family accounts from when I lived at home. What I found made me physically sick. They'd transferred $400,000 to a private account last year, the same month they'd announced the competition. They'd been contributing to our college funds throughout our childhoods, but those accounts showed zero balance now. The money that was supposed to pay for our educations had been liquidated and moved somewhere I couldn't track. I found email conversations between my mother and their financial advisor discussing estate planning strategies that maximized their retirement assets while minimizing what would eventually go to dependents, which is apparently how they referred to their children in financial documents. The picture that emerged was of 2 wealthy people who'd decided their children were expenses to be minimized rather than people to be loved, who'd created an elaborate competition not to determine who deserved inheritance, but to justify cutting all of us off while appearing to have given us a fair chance. They'd set targets they knew we couldn't meet, tracked our failures systematically, and planned to use our inevitable losses as proof that we didn't deserve their money. I called Lucas and May and asked them to meet me without telling our parents. We gathered at my apartment and I showed them everything I'd found. The financial transfers, the liquidated college funds, the emails discussing us as expenses. Lucas looked like I'd punched him in the stomach. He'd quit his PhD program and taken a corporate job he hated, had spent months depositing every spare dollar into that tracking account, and our parents had been playing games with money they didn't even need. May started crying, said she'd given up college and been living like a prisoner to save money, and it had all been for nothing. We'd all been destroying ourselves trying to win a competition that was rigged from the start, competing for parents who viewed us as financial burdens rather than children. The betrayal was so deep and systemic that we sat in my living room for hours just processing it, trying to understand how the people who raised us could do this. Eventually, Lucas asked what we were going to do with this information. We had proof our parents were manipulating us, but proof of what exactly? Being rich while making your kids compete wasn't illegal. Creating psychological competitions wasn't illegal. Being terrible parents wasn't a crime. Dr. Okafor helped me work through the strategic options when I brought her the financial documents I'd found. She said from a therapeutic perspective, the healthiest choice was probably to completely disengage from the competition and accept whatever financial consequences came with that. Our parents had created a system designed to harm us, and the only way to stop being harmed was to step out of the system entirely. But she also understood that wasn't a simple choice, that we were young adults who'd been counting on family support, who'd made educational and career decisions based on promised resources that were now being weaponized against us. She said if we wanted to confront our parents with the evidence, she'd support us, but we needed to be prepared for them to deny or justify everything, to double down on the competition rather than admit they'd been manipulating us. Abusive systems don't typically collapse when exposed, they just shift strategies. I asked if she'd be willing to document her professional assessment of what our parents were doing, and she said she'd already written a detailed report diagnosing the family dynamic as financially coercive and emotionally abusive. She gave me a copy to keep with my other evidence, told me it would stand up if we ever needed professional testimony about the psychological harm. The confrontation happened on a Saturday in March, 14 months into the competition. Lucas, May, and I showed up at our parents' house unannounced and asked for a family meeting. We laid out everything we'd found, the private account with $400,000, the liquidated college funds, the emails treating us as financial liabilities, Rita's information about their expensive vacation and property purchases. We had bank statements and email printouts and Dr. Okafor's psychological assessment. We presented it like prosecutors building a case, showing them we knew exactly what they'd been doing. My father's reaction was to deny that any of this was relevant to the competition. He said their personal finances were none of our business, that how they chose to spend their own money didn't change the terms of the agreement we'd all entered. The competition was about teaching us financial independence, and whether they had $400,000 or $4 million in their accounts didn't change the fact that we needed to learn to support ourselves. My mother added that we were being manipulative by digging into their private financial information, that this kind of behavior proved we weren't mature enough to handle family wealth responsibly. I pulled out my phone and started recording, told them I wanted their explanation on the record. Asked them directly, did they set financial targets they knew we couldn't meet? Did they liquidate our college funds to use for their own purposes? Did they view their children as expenses to be minimized? My father looked at the phone and said calmly that they'd made strategic financial decisions to optimize their retirement security, that our college funds had been reassigned to better investment vehicles, and that yes, they expected their adult children to be financially independent rather than dependent. The competition was giving us exactly that opportunity. I asked if he understood that Lucas had dropped out of his PhD program because of the financial pressure, that May had abandoned college at 19, that the competition was causing measurable psychological harm. He said those were choices we'd each made, and that learning to make strategic choices under pressure was valuable. If we couldn't handle the competition, that was information about our capabilities. The conversation in circles for an hour, with us trying to get them to acknowledge the cruelty and them reframing everything as valuable life lessons and fair meritocracy. Finally, I told them I'd be sharing the recording and the financial evidence with our extended family, with their friends, with anyone who thought they understood what kind of people my parents really were. Dad said I should do what I felt necessary, but it wouldn't change the competition terms. I uploaded the recording to a private YouTube channel and sent the link to my parents' siblings, their close friends, their professional colleagues, and our extended family. 37 people who'd known my parents for years and thought they were successful, generous, loving people. The video showed them calmly explaining that their children were expenses to be minimized, that the college funds they'd promised us had been reassigned, that Lucas quitting his PhD and May dropping out of school were just strategic choices we'd made under the financial pressure they'd created. I included Dr. Okafor's written assessment describing the family dynamic as abusive, included bank statements showing the $400,000 transfer, included the timeline showing how they'd launched the competition right after liquidating our college funds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My mother's sister called within 2 hours horrified, saying she'd thought this was some kind of misunderstanding, but the recording made it clear. My father's brother sent an email saying he was ashamed to be related to people who treated their children this way. Family friends started calling my parents directly, and from what I heard later, those conversations were devastating for my parents' social standing. The professional consequences hit my father particularly hard. He worked as a senior consultant for a corporate strategy firm, and several of his colleagues saw the video because I'd sent it to their company email addresses. His boss, a woman named Dorothy Chen, who had 3 children of her own, called him into a meeting to discuss whether someone who treated his own children as financial competitions could be trusted to give ethical business advice to clients. The firm didn't fire him, but they did put him on a performance improvement plan and removed him from several high-profile client accounts. My mother faced similar fallout at her company, where she'd built a reputation as a family-oriented executive who mentored young employees. Learning that she'd created a financial cage match between her own children damaged that image badly. They both became social pariahs in their professional and personal communities, uninvited from events, excluded from social groups, treated with the kind of cold politeness people reserve for those who've revealed themselves to be fundamentally untrustworthy. The aftermath for our family was complex and permanent. My parents sent a formal email 2 weeks after I released the video, stating that due to our violation of their privacy and our campaign to damage their reputations, they were ending the competition immediately and cutting all 3 of us off effective immediately. We were removed from their will, told not to contact them further, and informed that they considered us strangers. The tracking accounts were closed, the money we'd contributed was refunded, and we were officially disowned. May got back $26,000 she'd saved through brutal self-deprivation. Lucas got back $15,000 he'd earned by abandoning his research. I got back 0 because I'd never participated. In the end, we'd all lost, which I think was always the plan. My parents had gotten to spend 14 months watching us destroy ourselves competing, had gotten to feel powerful and in control, and had gotten to ultimately cut us off while claiming they'd given us every opportunity to succeed. The cruelty was the point, and they'd accomplished it perfectly. The 3 of us spent months in therapy, individual and family sessions, trying to repair the damage and rebuild relationships with each other. Lucas reapplied to PhD programs and got accepted into an even better environmental science program than the one he'd left, with full funding and a research fellowship. He was 24 and had lost a year, but he was back on track doing work he believed in. May enrolled in community college to finish her associate's degree, planning to transfer to a 4-year program in art history. She was 20 and had to restart her education, but she was doing it for herself now rather than for parental approval. I continued teaching, continued loving my work, and finally stopped feeling guilty about the modest salary because I understood my worth wasn't measured in dollars. We created our own family unit, the 3 of us, independent of our parents and their toxic value system. We celebrated holidays together, supported each other through struggles, and slowly learned to base our relationships on genuine care rather than financial competition. My parents never apologized, never acknowledged that what they'd done was harmful. They maintained to anyone who'd listened that they'd been trying to teach us financial responsibility, and we'd responded with betrayal and public humiliation. A few family members believed them, sided with them, cut contact with us in solidarity. But most people who saw the evidence understood what had really happened, that this hadn't been tough love or valuable lessons, but systematic psychological abuse dressed up as meritocracy. Dr. Okafor published a research paper on financial coercion in families, using our case as an anonymous example of how wealthy parents sometimes use money as a tool of control and manipulation. The paper got attention in family therapy circles, helped other therapists recognize and name this particular form of abuse. Our suffering had at least contributed to helping others identify similar patterns in their own families. 3 years after the competition ended, May graduated with her bachelor's degree in art history and got hired as an assistant curator at a small museum making $38,000 annually. Lucas finished his PhD and accepted a postdoctoral position studying wetland conservation making $55,000 a year. I was still teaching elementary school making $41,000 after several years of small raises. None of us were wealthy. Together, our 3 salaries added up to less than what our parents spent on their vacation property in a single year. But we were doing work we found meaningful, building lives based on our values, and supporting each other instead of competing. We'd survived our parents' attempt to turn us into profit-maximizing rivals, and we'd chosen to be family to each other instead. The tracking accounts were gone, the rankings were gone, the pressure to monetize our worth was gone. What remained was the relationship between 3 siblings who'd been through something terrible together and decided that surviving together was the only victory that mattered. I still think sometimes about that first dinner when my parents announced the competition, the spreadsheet projected on the wall showing our names in columns waiting to be filled with dollar amounts. I think about how normal everything had seemed before that moment, how I'd trusted that my parents wanted what was best for us, how naive I'd been about the conditionality of their love. The competition taught me that family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by who shows up for you when you're at your worst, who values you for who you are rather than what you can contribute. My parents failed that test completely. My siblings passed it. And that's how I learned who my real family was. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.